are going to study another great man in history. This one was William Shakespeare. He's a very famous playwright. That means he wrote plays in English. When you study English more in school, you will probably read some of his plays. You'll read his plays, maybe you'll act them out, you'll study them because they're very important to modern English culture and language and literature. So let's talk about who Shakespeare was and some of his works.
William Shakespeare was a British poet and playwright born on April 26, 1564 in Stratford, England. He is considered one of the world's best playwrights in the history of English literature. Shakespeare stood out in writing while attending grammar school as a child. Shakespeare moved to London and began his playwright career. He gained fame as a great playwright through his natural language skills and various expressions.
So Shakespeare was the master of literature. He was one of the best. He's the world's best playwright in English literature. So he wrote plays. William Shakespeare was a British poet and playwright. He wrote poems and plays. He was born on April 26th, 1564 in Stratford. It's a long time ago, Stratford, England. He's considered one of the world's best playwrights. In the history of English literature, all of English writing, he's one of the best. Shakespeare stood out. That means he was noticeable. He was so good, even when he was in school, even when he was really young. And Shakespeare moved to London and began his playwright career. So he began writing his plays. He became very famous. He became famous through his naturally good and amazing language skills and his expressions that he used in his writing. So, do you remember when Shakespeare was born? Long time ago, 1594. Where was he born? He was born in Stratford, which is in England. He was an English playwright. And what did it say about him? He was a poet. He wrote poems and plays, and he's considered one of the best. So now let's look at some of the plays and some of the pieces that he wrote so we can understand them better.
Shakespeare impressed many people through beautiful lines and dramatic acting. His work, Romeo and Juliet, was very popular with romantic atmosphere. The comedy such as A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Merchant of Venice made the audience think again about the value of love and friendship. Shakespeare's four major tragedies are Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, and Macbeth. They are still recognized as genius works which express human emotions, psychology, and life.
So what were some of his famous works? Well, he impressed many people through his beautiful lines and dramatic directing. For example, Romeo and Juliet, maybe you've heard about them, and its romantic atmosphere. Oh, he also wrote the comedy, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and The Merchant of Venice. Oh, so many. It made the audience think about lots of things, about the value of love and friendship. Oh, Shakespeare's four major tragedies are Hamlet, King Lear, Othello, and Macbeth, all so famous, they're still recognized as genius works even all of these years later. Oh, they express human emotion, psychology, life. That's all about Shakespeare. So he had four tragedies. Can we name some of them? Macbeth and Othello Those are two. He had tragedies. That means they were plays that were very, very sad. Othello and Macbeth are two of them. He also wrote comedies. A Midsummer Night's Dream is a comedy. It's a comedy that he wrote, so it's funny. So he wrote tragedies. These are sad plays. And he wrote comedies, fun and funny plays that make you laugh. And he wrote romances, like Romeo and Juliet.
William Shakespeare is also considered the greatest playwright in the history of literature.
He wrote 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and poetry books in his life. And he left a famous line from Hamlet: to be or not to be, that is the question.
Shakespeare laid the foundation for Western culture and Western literature. He created about 2,000 new words and idioms. The words and literary expressions created by Shakespeare are still actively used in English culture today.
So overall, he was the greatest playwright in literature. William Shakespeare is considered the greatest in the history of literature since the very beginning of writing. He wrote 38 plays, 154 sonnets, and poetry books. That's so much writing. And he left a famous line from Hamlet that we remember. To be or not to be, that is the question, and that's from Shakespeare. Shakespeare laid the foundation for Western culture and Western literature. He created about 2,000 new words and idioms, so many new words. The words and literary expressions created by Shakespeare are still actively used in English today. We still use them, and it's true. In English, there's so many idioms or expressions or things that we say, and they're examples from Shakespeare. We learned here his cultural impact. He's so important in English culture. So when you study more English words, more English literature, you're going to learn about Shakespeare. Do you remember how many new words he came up with? 2,000! He came up with over 2,000 new words and idioms. That's just so many. That was how impactful, how important Shakespeare was. So that was William Shakespeare, one of the best or the best playwright in the world. He contributed to literature. Literature is the whole body of stuff that's written, like poems or books or plays. Let's practice saying literature because you're going to hear it more when you study English in the future. Say it after me. Literature. Literature. It has T sounds and R sounds that have to be clear. Literature. Shakespeare wrote so many things. Let's name some of them. He wrote plays and sonnets, which are like short story plays. And he wrote poems. That's right. What were some of the pieces that he wrote? He wrote a famous romance called Romeo and Juliet. He wrote a tragedy, that means it was sad, called Macbeth. He wrote a comedy called A Midsummer Night's Dream. Tragedies, romances, comedies, Shakespeare wrote so much. So that's William Shakespeare, born in England, the world's best playwright. And you'll study him when you learn more about English because he had such a big impact on English culture. Do you remember how many words he thought of? New words. 2,000! That means when Shakespeare was writing to when he finished writing, he created 2,000 new words that we now use in English. So you can think of this video in a couple years when you study Shakespeare in school. Because if you study English more, you'll cover Shakespeare because he was just so influential.